second wave. So as nurses, we have the maximum opportunity to spend time when the patient is in hospital. And as nurses, we work in OPDs, we work in with doctors' consultation rooms to assist them, where we again meet these patients when they come for a post-COVID follow-up. And apart from as nurses, I think as individuals, especially during the second COVID wave, I don't think there's any family which has not seen COVID. There is either a member or two, or sometimes an entire family that's been affected with COVID. It has not just touched other people, it has touched me. I'm sure many of your lives have been touched by COVID. We have COVID patients in our family, we have them in our neighborhood. And as nurses, I think most people ask us as to what should we do. We have lots of issues even after we have recovered after COVID. How will you guide us? So I think from that perspective, we as nurses, it's very important for us to know what to advise a post-COVID patient who is still having some lingering symptoms of COVID. We have had two talks prior to this on post-COVID care, one by Dr. Akshay and second by Dr. Vidya yesterday. It was a very good perspective of an allopathic view and an Ayurvedic view of looking at COVID and post-COVID treatment. That was a treatment part. We are going to talk about the care part, the nursing care part today. So this is the outline of my talk, today's talk. We will first go through how a patient recovers from COVID briefly, what are the stages of recovery, what post-COVID symptoms that most patients struggle with even after recovery. I mean, even after testing negative or no more carrying a virus with them. What's the need for isolation if they get discharged from the hospital? Do they need a medical follow-up? And if yes, how long? When to seek emergency help? And what home care should they take for themselves? What kind of food they should eat? And what about post-COVID vaccination? When can they take vaccines? I think I've just tried to think that what could be the common things that can be asked to us by our patients and general public. Can we have next slide, Ramya? Yes. So as I was just saying that every life has been touched today by COVID, and there's a very high reported incidence of post-COVID symptoms. Yesterday, Dr. Akshay Rao was talking about, most patients said they had a fatigue and it was ignored initially. And today, fatigue becomes the most common symptom. However, there are other symptoms also, like dry cough and all. And these minor symptoms have been found among more than 50% patients. Those who have recovered. So 58.2 is one of the article gave me the incidence of post-COVID symptoms among the patients who have recovered and gone home. Among all this, the prolonged illness, which we call it prolonged if it exists beyond 4 weeks of time, it exists among 10% of patients. From the yesterday's, especially Dr. Rao's talk, you must have understood that there are multiple organ systems that get affected when one gets infected, especially with moderate or severe COVID infection. And these effects last longer. The organ systems that remain affected probably may include lungs, heart, kidney, brain, etc. There's also a very high incidence of thrombotic complications, like patients suffering minor strokes or even having myocardial infarction. Or just yesterday, I was watching a television report where in Mumbai hospital, there's a high incidence of mesenteric clots the patients are brought with. Some of them had developed intestinal gangrenes. So these are thrombotic complications that the patients at various places are suffering with. And of course, we all are very much aware because of the media coverage that has been given to mucormycosis. Not just the media coverage, I think many states by now have declared mucormycosis as an epidemic. I think there are at least 10 states, if I'm not wrong, in the entire country who have declared mucormycosis as a epidemic. So there is high incidence, of course, in pockets, but we can't say whether it will happen in our place also tomorrow. So we need to be on watch for all these things. Can we have next slide, Ramya? So I just try to address some of the questions that probably the patient will ask when he's going home. So that he probably might ask us, when will I get perfectly better after having COVID-19? So there are basically three stages we need to understand to answer this question of the patient, that there is an acute COVID. When I have got an infection, I may have generally symptoms for myself for 3 to 4 weeks of time, and generally if the illness was mild, wherein if I didn't have symptoms or I had very mild symptoms, then the illness will not last longer than 4 weeks. So for such patients you can tell that you may not have symptoms beyond 4 weeks time. Patients who were severely ill during the acute stage, and if they required more medications, like they had to be put on steroids, etc., remdesivir, these patients may have longer symptoms, which may last between 4 weeks to 12 weeks. That's 1 month to 3 months after being infected. And if they were very sick, if they had to be put on a ventilator, needed an admission in an ICU, then these patients may suffer of a long COVID. That's, we call it symptoms lasting more than 12 weeks of time. Although this information exists in the literature, I think what is safer to tell patients is the symptoms of COVID will last for a variable degree, for a variable duration for different patients, because COVID is a mystery. Nobody has till now understood that how long. So there is no specific cutoff that one can give that by this week your symptoms will go. We all need to be patient, wait and watch, and take care of patients when they are at home, continue taking care, and hope that slowly the symptoms will fade away. So this is what has been observed in most patients. So that is what is put. However, there is no deadline that by this time the symptoms go perfectly. Next slide, please. So who is at a risk for longer COVID? So most patients will recover, say, even if they were moderately sick by end of 3 months. So who are the patients who might have lingering symptoms of COVID? I mean, post-COVID lingering symptoms. People who are more than 50 years of age, people who have experienced more severe form of disease, people who had comorbidities, especially like cardiopulmonary diseases, they were diabetic before, they had hypertension or obesity. Obesity is one of the very big risk factor for people to have longer, recovery time. And of course, if the patients are heavy smokers and alcohol users, then their recovery may be longer. So this is what you need to keep in mind while you advise your patients on how long will your symptoms last. Can we have the next slide? So what symptoms are most likely to persist? I think both the speakers yesterday have covered, Dr. Akshay covered them at a greater length, and he also tried to give you insights as to why these symptoms come for patients. So I will not go in those details. The more likely symptoms that the patients tend to have in observation so far, what we have learned is feeling very tired. That's extreme fatigue. Trouble breathing. They continue to have little breathing difficulty. They may have chest discomfort, a feeling of pressure or congestion in the chest, a dry cough, joint or muscle pains which continue for few weeks, brain fog, that's inability to concentrate, or impaired memories. Patients might tell you that, I just forget if something that was well known to me. I know that I know it, and I'm not able to find words and express. This is what we call brain fog, that the conscious gets clouded. They are not able to answer, or they are not able to find correct words, or they are not just able to remember where they kept certain things just this morning. So these kind of things might happen. Yesterday, Dr. Akshay also talked about students who are complaining of brain fog when they are studying for exams. They are not able to memorize the content. So these are most likely symptoms. The other symptoms that the patients can continue to have are loss of sense of smell and taste, which generally doesn't last very long, but may continue for a week or two. The headache patients have, runny nose. Some patients have skin rashes that develop. Those could be secondary to the anticoagulants also that are given to them. So we need to just be observant of these. Dental problems, I think none of the speakers spoke about it, but in my own experience, I have seen people complaining of loose teeth, loose tooth, having a loss of tooth, teeth turning black, and this has more happened commonly in Maharashtra, one certain district. So I think we need to be on a dental and oral observation of patients also. Trouble sleeping, excessive sweating, diarrhea, these are other symptoms that may transiently be there and may continue for a little while after their recovery, from COVID. Psychological symptoms, trouble thinking clearly, focusing or remembering things. Anxiety is most common, depression in some, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of them may suffer because of period of isolation. They suffer of great levels of fear when they were diagnosed with COVID, and if they had to get admitted to ICU. In my experience, I've had many people also reporting that loss of confidence. They feel very scared to go out another time, even for their second follow-up checkup. Also, patients are very skeptical. They have no confidence. How will I catch an auto or a cab and reach a hospital? They are not very sure of themselves. So these are kind of symptoms that the patients may continue to have. So how do we advise them about this? If they ask you, how long will I be contagious? For a mild illness, generally, mild illness wherein patient either had no symptom or had mild kind of fever, sore throat, cough, which lasted for a day or two, or maybe max 4 days, and then patient became all right. For such patients, if all of the following is true, then they can stop self-isolation. One is if they have completed 10 days of period from the time they develop symptom. Second is if they have no fever now, that's without taking an antibiotic. And third is their symptoms have considerably reduced. So if all of these three things are true, then the patients can stop self-isolating. Moderate to severe illness, this generally, if the patients were severely ill when they go home, they are advised by their physicians to isolate themselves, continue isolating themselves at home for another 14 days period after discharge. This probably is not because they may have some dead virus that they may be carrying, but their immunity is quite lowered with high doses of steroids that are given to them, and they are actually susceptible to catch a lot of other infections. So it is advisable that these patients stay in home isolation, separate themselves and guard themselves against anybody who has any other kind of infection. Can we have next slide? Next question our patients might ask us as nurses is, do I need a medical follow-up? I'm getting discharged after completing my treatment. If mild illness and generally beyond 10 days, you have no symptoms at all, you are perfectly fine. For such patients, usually no follow-up is advised. Moderate to severe illness, if they required oxygen, if they required steroids, if they were admitted in ICU, they require a ventilation. For such patients, at least for 2 months, once in 2 weeks, it is advisable by MOHF, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, that bi-weekly follow-up to be done with the physician. What do physicians do on these bi-weekly? The patient might ask, why should I go and meet them once in 2 weeks? The physicians will do the symptom review, how far the symptoms are there. They might conduct a physical assessment, repeat some certain laboratory tests like C-reactive protein, D-dimer values, the basic laboratory, CBC values, and they may want to repeat a chest X-ray or CT scan if it's required. Like yesterday, Dr. Akshay was talking that some of them might develop pulmonary fibrosis, and then their respiratory symptoms might get even worse after the fibrosis develops. They may not be able to maintain their saturations. So for these sakes, these treatment, these investigations may be required, and based on the investigation and the review of the patient, the physician may want to review some of the medications. So that is why a patient should go and see the physician. Next slide. This is very important. When should I seek emergency help? This is what we as nurses should be perfectly able to advise a patient, because this is very, very necessary. Patients should not feel that when they go home that they are now perfectly fine. Ramya? And they must keep in mind that they need to be observant of themselves. They need to do a self-assessment. They need to be observant of any other symptoms or worsening symptoms that happen, because those could be signals of trouble, wherein he or she may not have, he or she may have a bigger complication. It may be a sign of an impending complication. So patients should immediately seek medical help in case if there is a very, very severe fatigue. What do we mean by very severe fatigue? If I'm sitting on a chair and I'm not able to get up at all, I feel so tired to move around. That itself indicates that there's something very grossly wrong with me. I must immediately seek medical help. Chest discomfort that troubles me, a pressure sensation on my chest, or if there is some kind of chest pain that I develop, then I must go and see a doctor. Shortness of breath. Generally, a little breathing difficulty may persist for most patients. But if I feel that I'm sitting at one place and I still have breathing trouble and my SpO2 levels are less than 95%, then it's time that I see a physician. Focal weakness. Some of the patients, as I said, thromboembolic complications are common. Sometimes they might develop a paresis or paralysis of one side, a hand or a limb might get weak, or there may be slurred speech, or there could be, patient having inability to chew or move there or talk properly. So in such cases, the patient should seek immediate help from the hospital. Facial swelling, eyelid swelling, which is painful. This is a very important thing that nurses should advise patients. Especially, this is an indication that there is either a very heavy sinus congestion, or this is also a sign of mucormycosis. So this should not be neglected at all. The patient should be advised that if you have these kind of things, you should immediately seek medical help. Blurring of vision. This also happens in case of mucormycosis. It's a very common symptom of mucormycosis. The black discoloration inside nose or mouth. Please advise all your patients to maintain their oral hygiene. Brush your teeth twice a day. Take a torch or in bright sunlight early in the morning. Inspect the inside of your mouth, especially the roof of the mouth, inside of the nose. If you could see any kind of a black discoloration, either in the nose or in the mouth, even that's a sign of mucormycosis. It spreads very, very fast. So patient needs to immediately contact the hospital. If at early stage the help is sought, treatment is possible. The development of any new symptoms that are bothersome, any other, because we still are discovering COVID. We do not know. It's just yesterday that the mesenteric clots have started developing. Patients there in Mumbai were complaining of severe diarrhea and acute abdominal pain. And when they were brought to hospital and when they were examined, it was found that they had clots and their intestines were already gangrenous. So anything that is very bothersome for patient, we don't know what that anything could be. Further, ask the patient to seek help. What care should I take at home? So we focus here on what are the common symptoms that the patient will have, and with regards to that, what do we advise them? So self-health monitoring, this has to be continued at home for patients at least for few weeks till their symptoms last. Temperature, they must check at least twice a day their temperature. And if fevers, like Dr. Akshay was saying, a mild fever may continue, say about 99 °F. But if the fever rises above 100, it could be an indication of a bacterial secondary infection. So patients should immediately see the doctor. The blood pressures for a normotensive, previously normotensive people, they should maintain their blood pressures within normal limits or at least less than 130/90. Any pressures above this 130/90 or equal should be reported to physician. Most of the patients also have an opportunity today to do an online consultation with the physician. So if in case of doubt, you can advise them to consult a physician online and report their readings. Patients should also check their blood sugars, although they were normal glycemic before going to COVID, because those who've taken corticosteroids, even if they were non-diabetic before, their glucose levels
Ma'am, we could not hear you, ma'am.
to physician, it might require a change of medication for a patient. The patients have to continue doing pulse oximetry at home at least twice a day, if possible thrice a day. If the saturations anytime drop below 95, they must report to their physician. Like Dr. Akshay was saying, we have shortage of beds and we are discharging patients on a home oxygen therapy. There are a lot of companies giving oxygen concentrators and patients use nasal cannulas or masks for taking oxygen therapy at home. You need to teach patients that they need to keep their mask or nasal cannulas clean at all times. They can have two pairs of such tubings and a mask and prongs, which can be used alternate days, and the one which is used can be washed properly, first cleaned with alcohol swab, then washed with soap and water and dried in sunlight and wiped, and then reused to prevent any kind of source of infection. You need to advise them that if they're using oxygen at home, they should not be smoking near the oxygen delivery device, or any kind of electric switches or fire hazards have to be kept in mind, because there is a risk of fire breaking out at home with a lot of oxygen around. So this is about the self-health monitoring you should teach your patients. About ease of breathing, those who have breathing difficulty, continue to have little breathing troubles, you can advise them on simple breathing exercises like diaphragmatic breathing. You can advise them on simple pranayama techniques like Anulom Vilom. I think we have a session by Dr. Sundar tomorrow, who's a physiotherapist. So he will be talking at length about different kinds of exercises. So I will not get into that today. So teach, but I think as nurses, you all know how to teach pursed lip breathing to your patient, how to teach basic diaphragmatic breathing techniques. So you can do that with your patients. Steam inhalation for chest congestion. Advise them to take twice a day steam inhalation if they have chest congestion. Ask them to pace their activities, not to do too much activity at once, because that might get them tired and that might increase breathlessness. So they need to space their activities. If you eat a large meal, it leads to breathlessness. So ask patients, instead of 3 or 4 big meals, eat several small meals. It could be even 8 meals a day. Eat very little at more frequent times. Every 2 hours you can eat, but eat very small meals. That can help with breathing troubles. Fatigue is the most common problem that most of the patients are complaining. The advice is very simple, but it can help them in a long way. So you can tell them to plan their activities early in the early hours of the morning. As we all know, the circadian rhythm, our cortisol levels are high in the morning. We have more energy levels in the morning. So if we try to schedule, if I'm a lady and I'm a post-COVID, I can schedule my cooking activities, cleaning activities in early hours of the day, so that later my energy levels deplete and I tend to get tired. So if I finish my important task in the morning, then I may experience lesser fatigue. Pace activities again. Take short breaks. Do not overexert. Do not try to do 3 4 tasks one after another. There's another thing that they can do is prioritize the task. Understand what's most important, what is next important, and what is not very important, that they can either delegate it to somebody, or if it is not done at home, Especially, I think for ladies context, these points are very important because they have to do a lot of household works. And if it was a small family and there was nobody to look after them, they have to do their household chores. So they have to set priorities. Is it important every day to wash clothes? Is it important to do dusting every day? So some of the things, they can prioritize for themselves, and conserve their energy. What do we mean by conservation of energy? The day-to-day small tasks when they're doing, I'm cleaning a vegetable. Instead of standing at the kitchen platform, I can take a stool and sit at a table and do it. I'm conserving energy because sitting takes less energy than standing. So my fatigue levels might help to resolve to an extent, my fatigue levels. And another most important thing, I think, which Ayurveda propagates, and I feel it's very important, it has been a personal experience that patients should expose themselves to an early morning sunlight. Early sunlight is a source of vitamin D. Sunlight has a lot of healing properties. It helps to reduce fatigue. It energizes. So I think these are the simple measures that nurses we can advise our patients to self-monitor, ease breathing, and reduce fatigue. Next slide, please. Sleep problems. A lot of patients have sleep problems. So simple advices for sleep problems, what we as nurse can give them: establish sleeping and waking up routine. Sleep at 10 o'clock, wake up at 6 o'clock, or form your routine. Do not stay awake for longer times. Do not watch your mobile phones, TVs for longer time, because screen watching will take away your sleep. Do not take caffeine or alcohol late in the day, because that makes your nervous system active and you may have difficulty falling asleep. It's a good idea to take a warm water shower and do a small prayer or listen to a meditative music, and that may solve your sleep problems. Other advice that you can give to your patients is hygiene. Hygiene is very important: the personal hygiene, the oral hygiene, the hand hygiene. Please advise them on all of these, so that they don't have secondary infections. Avoid smoking and alcohol because that can really prolong your recovery. Do salt water gargles and steam inhalation because that goes long way, especially for patients who have sore throat and cough. You can take the right kind of a diet and do some moderate level of activity or exercises every day. Do not be lying down all the time, because that increases. Lying down in the bed all the time throughout the day may increase the risk of complication. Continue with the medical treatment. There is not much great medications that are advised for post-COVID patients. Some of them may get some cough medications if they had cough. They may have some vitamin supplements, and if their D-dimer levels or C-reactive proteins are still higher, the doctors tend to put them on low-dose aspirin for anticoagulation. So you must advise them on that. Need for rehabilitation. Patients who were really very severely ill or had comorbidities like hypertension, cardiac, pulmonary problems might require a specialist help from a physiotherapist, from a psychiatrist, or sometimes from an occupational therapist. So if you feel that these patients require such a help, advise them to seek help. Next slide. What should I eat home? This is a big question that most patients will ask definitely to nurses. Not all patients go to dietitians. If they had comorbidities and they required more dietary adjustment, we as nurses should advise them a dietary consultation. But today, 90% of patients are affected with COVID and everybody needs advice, and not everybody can seek a dietary consultation. So this is a general guideline what we can advise most patients, that how their meal should be. While we advise our patient, we must keep in mind, are they hypertensive? Do they have diabetes? Do they have kidney dysfunction or a cardiac involvement? Because in such cases, we may not be able to advise them on, we should not be advising them on drinking a lot of water or taking salt in their diet, or eating proteins may be restricted in case of a kidney dysfunction. So those things will have to be kept in mind. Digestive disturbances. A lot of patients have this loss of taste and smell. So they may be having a loss of appetite and not be able to eat at once. Contrary to that, like Dr. Akshay also said, in the initial stages of after immediately discharge, some patients may be having a voracious appetite, feeling too hungry. So both cases you should be able to judge and advise them as to what should be told to them. Difficulty in breathing can interfere with eating and digestion, so that has to be kept in mind. Swallowing difficulty, especially if the patient was intubated, he or she may have a swallowing difficulty. So you need to advise patients on certain techniques or refer them to a physiotherapist who can teach them those techniques to swallow food. General guidelines on diet, we should keep in mind that there should be consistency in meal times. You cannot have haphazard way of eating. You should have very consistent meal times, everyday setup. What do I eat? The food should be fresh, home cooked food, which is full of nutrients. The diet alone cannot do wonders. To digest the food, the body requires some kind of exercise. So at least at 20 minutes of some kind of physical activity every day, the patient should be doing. It could be even household work. The patient shouldn't be all the time lying in the bed. And yes, for digestion, very important thing is 7 to 8 hours of good sleep at night. If your sleep is disturbed, you will have digestive disturbances. That you need to tell your patients. Next slide, please. This is a general guide that we can use to teach our patients how should they be eating. If you look at this circle, this is a 9-inch plate, and you can see the quarter of this plate here is divided into, again, a bigger half and a smaller half, where you have the bigger half consists of proteins, which are essential body building blocks. So this much portion of the plate, patient's plate should have in each meal some kind of a protein. So that can be beans, pulses, fish, egg, meat, dals, whatever, based on whether the patient is vegetarian or non-vegetarian. Dairy products should occupy this blue portion, a small portion of the plate. The oils and other fats should occupy a very small portion of the plate. And the rest of the 3/4 of the plate of the patient should be divided into two halves, and one half should be full of fresh green leafy vegetables and other vegetables, and the other half should be cereals. So cereals the sources of cereals could be potatoes, bread, rice, pasta, whole wheat flour, ragi in our Indian meals. It could be, all of these are examples of cereals. The patient should drink at least 8 glasses of water in a day to detoxify the body and to keep the urine dilute. The patient should not eat too much of these things like bakery products, chips, fried things. If he or she is trying to eat the ready-made food items, should check the labels of the food. The food should not be high on salt, sugars, and fats. Next slide. This is a meal plan. Generally, a post-COVID patient, if he's a sedentary, a lady can be advised for up to 2,000 calories, and a man can be advised for up to 2,500 kilocalorie diet in a day. This gives a little glimpse of why carbohydrates are required. You need to teach this to your patient, that carbohydrates provide you energy. They come from your potatoes, bread, pasta, ragi, whole wheat flour, and other whole grains that you use. All these whole grains give you fiber that prevents constipation and keeps your gut clean. Eat plenty of fruits and vegetables because they give you vitamins, minerals. At least 5 portions of green leafy vegetables and fruit should form your day's diet. What do we mean by one portion? One portion is equal to half cup or roughly 100 grams. So 5 portions of fruits and vegetable, that means throughout the day, at least 5 times half cup of either vegetable or fruits. You know about the food exchanges you have been taught. So use that knowledge there and advise patients how to eat fruits and vegetables. Protein foods, as these are building blocks of the body, these constitute a very important part, especially during the recovery. So at least 2 to 3 meals in a day should constitute proteins. If the patient was more than 65-year-old, then each meal of the patient should have some amount of protein in that. The good sources of protein are meat, fish, eggs, dairy products like yogurt, milk, cheese, different kinds of beans, lentils, nuts, paneer, tofu, soya. So you can advise all these. If the patient is non-vegetarian, you can advise that one portion of a oily fish like mackerel, salmon, or sardines to be taken at least once in a week. One portion equals to 100 grams. Dairy foods, if the patient likes dairy products, he should take them in diet because they help in improving calcium. They give calcium and different kinds of minerals for the patient. So at least 3 times in a day, food should have dairy products like milk, yogurt, cheese. If the patient is a vegan patient who doesn't take milk and milk products, the other sources of calcium and minerals could be leafy vegetables, beans, chickpeas, nuts like almonds, sesame seeds, dried figs, oranges, and again the fish, salmon and sardines. The high energy foods, these are foods that give empty calories, especially that is they are high in fat, they are high in sugar, they have no other nutrients in them. So these foods should be minimized, especially if the patient was overweight or obese. That means if his BMI is more than 25, these kind of foods as much as possible should be avoided. The foods include like chips, fried foods, meat, pies, fizzy drinks, all your ready-made drinks, they are high on sugar. So those should be avoided, chocolates, cream cakes, and if the patient was diabetic, these should be kept at bay. Fluid is a very important thing because fluid helps to detoxify your body, cleanse your system. So you should advise your patient to drink at least 8 glasses of water in a day. Water is the best natural drink that the nature has given, and it helps to keep our bodies healthy. So teach this to your patients. Fluids should not be taken at once. They should be spaced. 8 glasses of water should be taken throughout the day at some intervals. How do you know whether you're taking adequate fluids? Look at your urine. If your urine is dark, that means your fluid intake is low. You need to increase it. Your urine should look pale yellow in color. Limit intake, although we say fluids which also constitute fruit juices, do advise your patients not to take over-the-counter available those market fruit juices because they have very high sugar content and which may do bad to patients. So in case if they want to drink also just a glass, that's not more than 150 ml a day. This is a sample menu for a COVID patient. I just kept it for your knowledge. Most dietitians are advising this sample menu for their patient. 7 a.m., 4 soaked almonds, 4 soaked black raisins or 2 dates instead of black raisins can be advised. There are 2 options I have given. I will just read through these. 1 whole egg omelette patient can have, or with 1 bread slice and an orange or a sweet lime. Or if he's a South Indian, can prefer to have 2 small dosas or 3 small idlis with a coconut chutney plus 4 slices of pineapple or pomegranate or papaya. It's or, it's not and. So you see these portion sizes are very small. We are trying to give small meals at a frequent time. So meal 3, that's at around 11 a.m. Let patient eat some handful of, dry fruits, like it could consist of 5 almonds, 2 walnuts, 4 pistachios and 2 cashews, and have 1 glass of lemon juice. Or instead of this, a South Indian could prefer to have a glass of rasam with pepper. Next. Meal 4 can form a dal khichdi, potato sabji, or for other patient it could be a small 1 bowl of rice, 1 bowl of chicken or fish. When we say chicken curry, it should have minimum 3 medium-sized pieces of chicken plus 100 grams of carrot or cucumber. Meal 5 could be at 4 p.m. where they drink something instead of tea or coffee. They drink a ginger tea or a lemongrass tea with a fistful of chana, roasted chana, because that gives a protein. Patients can have a ginger, elaichi, honey kadha. And take 1 cup of roasted makhna. Makhna are those lotus seeds which are roasted, not fried. So these can be advised. Meal 6 could be rasam with pepper, or patients can take 1 cup of tomato or a broccoli soup. Meal 7, we advise them to eat their dinner early. Eat 2 fulkas. Fulkas are smaller than chapatis and they are prepared without oil. 100 gram paneer bhurji, which gives them a lot of protein, and then there is a grated carrot salad which gives them vitamins, minerals. 1 cup of rice with 100 gram of chicken curry and with 100 gram of cabbage or capsicum salad. Last meal of the day for every patient should be a small cup of milk with 1 teaspoon of haldi, the golden milk, which will do wonders in healing. Next. So I think you got a good idea about how to advise on diet, because that's a very, very important part that the patients generally ask. Okay, so most patients might also ask you that I've now recovered of COVID. When should I take my vaccine? So if they were COVID positive, and they had not taken the vaccine earlier, they are okay. They should be okay to take it 3 months after their recovery. If the patient was COVID positive and he had received antibodies or plasma as a therapy, then he or she should take the vaccine again after 3 months after the discharge from the hospital. If the patient was infected, like say I took one dose of vaccine and then after 1 or 2 weeks I got infected with COVID, then when should I take my vaccine? I can take it again 3 months after my recovery. I think for you as nursing students to remember is a basic guideline. 3 months after recovery you can take a vaccine. If I was hospitalized for a severe illness, then when should I take it? After 4 to 8 weeks. 4 to 8 week make, this is not COVID illness, this is other illness. And if, yeah, so other things apply to other patient populations. So this I just included because as nursing students you should know when to take which doses and which population can take which vaccine. Patients might also ask you, some of them, that if I took a vaccine, when can I donate my blood? Anybody who's taken vaccine can donate the blood 14 days after the vaccination. No RT-PCR testing is required. Some of the patients might ask you, if I have to take vaccine, do I need to repeat my RT-PCR to know whether I'm negative now? That is not required if you have finished your 10 to 15 days of isolation period. This is what you should teach your patients. Next slide. This is very important. Last, but the most important thing, you need to tell all your post-COVID patients that although they were positive, and now if they have taken vaccine, it's a good thing that they have taken a vaccine now, but they must know that no vaccine is 100% effective. There is a chance of person getting infected after vaccination. Although the person getting infected after vaccination is expected not to develop a very severe disease, he may be a virus carrier. He may spread it to other people. So he should still continue to wear a mask even after vaccination and after recovery from COVID. And after taking vaccine, it takes around 2 weeks of time for them to develop some kind of immunity. So emphasize that keep washing hands, maintain a physical distance, cover your face with mask, and don't spit in public spaces. Next. Yeah, this is a conclusion slide that I wanted to tell you, a quote by Florence Nightingale, that we give all these advices, we tell them their warning signals, but we, through our advice, the aim of our advice should be calm down the patient and to assure him that his recovery is possible and he will recover sooner or later with all his efforts, with your advice. The patient should not be kept anxious and apprehensive, which most of the post-COVID patients are very apprehensive. So if they remain mentally disturbed or mentally, fearful of things, they ought to have some complications. So that's what I think. She was a very wise lady, our founder of our profession, Florence Nightingale. She said, the apprehension, uncertainty, waiting, expectation, fear of surprises do a patient more harm than any exertion or disease. So we as nurses must keep this in mind while we talk to our patients and teach them about their home care. So next slide, please. Yeah, these are my references. So thank you. It has been a monologue, a one-sided dialogue, but I hope I have helped you understand that how should you be answering the queries of post-COVID patients as a nurse. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your informative session. That was your effort and thoughts on focusing what need to be followed in real time during post-COVID care. Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, we have two of questions which has been posted in the panel.
Okay.
The first question is, what are the measures to prevent mucormycosis at home?
I think there is no perfect thing we can say that if you do this, the mucormycosis can be prevented as such. But one of the measure, I think, what as an from allopathic background, I can say is early identification. Because one thing I think for prevention, yes, what you could do is keep your sugars in tight control, the blood sugars, because as long as the blood sugars are on rise, because till now whatever patients are seen who have developed mucormycosis, most of them have had an uncontrolled diabetes. Sugars were not in control. So control your sugars, keep them in normal limits, watch your diet, do not include any kind of added sugar to your food, and yes, every day clean your nose properly, keep your dental hygiene, look inside your nose, look inside your mouth, check if you have a swelling around your eyes, on your face, and if that's painful, and then immediately get evaluated. This could keep mucormycosis in check.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, there is another question that in some article they have read that steam inhalation is not good to follow, stating that inhaling steam leads to the spread of virus to the lungs. Can you please share your thoughts on this, ma'am?
Yeah, I've been listening. There's been a lot of discussion on steam inhalation, and I personally wonder why there has been so much of debate about steam inhalation when it was so much acceptable measure. We always followed for patients who had respiratory, especially upper respiratory problems in the past. This is nothing very different. Coronavirus infection is primarily the upper respiratory infection, which affects your nose and sinuses, and sometimes it might go in lower respiratory tract and lead to a pneumonia. I think it's very imaginary, and there's no evidence that if you take steam that the virus will migrate down to the lungs and would lead to fibrosis of lungs. It's a too imaginary thing to do. So I think I would not say there's evidence, but my common sense tells me that steam would not do harm. If you didn't have an upper respiratory issue like cough, sore throat, or congestion, you need not take it. If you had it, I think it should help.
Yes, yes. Thank you, ma'am. That's all like we have the questions panel, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your thoughts and views.
Thank you, Ramya.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
You may go to the next session, Ramya, if you are ready. I think it's, yeah.
She will join by 2:50, ma'am. Once she
Oh,
joins.
all right. All right.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Dear participants, I request everyone to stay back as we have a next session by Ms. Harshita, clinical psychologist. The topic is mental health support during post-COVID time. So I would request everyone to hold on.
Ramya ma'am,
Yes, sir.
I think you shared one Google Docs in the chat box. No? Just want to
Yes, sir.
inform that. Once again, you can remind the audience also.
Yes, yes. Dear participants, there is a Google feedback form. I would kindly request everyone to fill that form and submit it for every session. So that form, you can see that in the chat column. Harshita, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes. Ma'am, can you just increase your volume?
Yes, it is maximum.
Yeah,
Is it better now?
yeah, we could hear you.
Everything is
Welcome to
fine?
the webinar, ma'am.
Yes, thank you.
So, dear participants, now we have a session on mental health support by our clinical psychologist, Ms. Harshita. Ms. Harshita is a practicing clinical psychologist licensed by Rehabilitation Council of India. Madam holds an MPhil in clinical psychology from Kasturibai Medical College, Manipal, and has been working at the Department of Psychiatry, MS Ramaya Medical College and Hospital since 3 years. Ma'am deals with psychotherapy for anxiety, depression, personality disorders, marital therapy, substance use, and several other psychiatric conditions. Ma'am specialized in the areas of cognitive, clinical, and health psychology. Also, ma'am deals primarily with a cognitive behavioral therapy. Ma'am, we welcome you for the session. You could share your slides.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Ma'am, I don't have access to share.
Yeah, I'll do that, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Just a minute. Ma'am, you could share it, right?
Is it visible to you?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, put it in slideshow, no?
Yes, 1 second. Is this okay?
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Thank you, ma'am.
Can I start, ma'am? Am I audible, visible? Are the slides visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Everything is fine?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I don't know who I'm addressing, by the way. Is it only the nurses from Ramaya or is it?
My name is Ramya,
across?
ma'am.
Okay.
No, she's asking who she's addressing to. Ms. Harshita, there are nursing students in audience. There is faculty from nursing college. There are
Okay.
nurses from Ramaya, both our hospitals who have joined us.
Okay.
And there are also nursing students from some other colleges who join. Yeah.
This is great to know. So essentially, I'm addressing the whole batch of nurses. So
Yes, yes.
before I start my presentation, then I think from the doctors fraternity and from myself personally, a huge shout out to all you nurses and sincere thanks from our end for everything that you're doing. It's not easy to do what you guys are doing for the past 1 year, and consistently you have been doing that. I think if not for you, we would not have survived COVID at all. So sincere thanks to all of you, to each one of you personally, and I hope that you are all staying safe. So, so I come from the Department of Psychiatry. My name is Harshita. I'm a clinical psychologist. And as much as you're dealing with COVID and you're dealing with cases in the ward and in the ICU, there have been enough and more studies and cases that have come up recently where even post-discharge, once you go back home, there have been post-COVID complications that have been seen in a lot of clients. So one with respect to neurological, orthopedic, neuropsychiatric, in general, breathing difficulties, respiratory difficulties, these are all one domain. The other domain of difficulties that we have seen is with respect to psychiatric conditions that are seen in COVID cases. So today's presentation I'm going to be dealing mainly with some of the most common psychiatric conditions that one might observe post-discharge in the COVID patients. So we're talking about COVID patients who have turned positive and then who have probably been admitted either for their high biochemical markers or because of high CT scan scores or because their saturation levels are low, whatever be the reason for admission. the cases that I am looking at today would be cases who have been positive, who have been admitted in the hospital, and then who have turned negative and have been discharged from the hospital. So they're done with their 14-day quarantine period post hospitalization as well. So after this, there have been certain symptoms that have been noticed in the patient's post-COVID recovery. So these are the cases that I will be talking about. So to basically start with the presentation, I'm going to give you a couple of case scenarios or case studies that we saw in the past couple of months. So very recently, just last week, I saw a 30-year-old patient that I had that he was probably, you can say, asymptomatic to mild symptoms. That's it. And because he was alone, there was nobody to take care of him. That's why he sought a hospital admission. So in the hospital, he was in a general ward with a lot of other patients. And he was pretty much fine. The hardly admission was for about 4 to 5 days, and then we advised home isolation. So he was sent back. So within those 4 to 5 days period, once he recovered and once he went back, 2 months after admission, he had symptoms such as I'm feeling extremely scared. I'm feeling very low. I don't feel like going back to work. I feel very restless. I'm scared about what if I contract the disease again? What if I turn positive? I'm a threat to the other people. Despite being so cautious, I was the one who turned positive. I don't know what's happening. So all of these thoughts sort of spiraled into, initially it was mild anxiety and depression. And because he did not seek treatment for that, finally it turned into a full-blown severe depression. And last week when I started seeing him, it was a case of high depression where we had to put him on severe antidepressants. This was case one. The other case that we got to see was somebody, we have a psychiatric helpline for patients who can reach out to us. So we had a son who had called up on behalf of the father saying almost a month after he had turned negative and he had gotten back to his regular routine, there were severe memory losses that were seen in that patient, and there was a lot of anger outbursts, changes in personality. This was the other set of phenomena that we saw. Now, the third case scenario that we saw was with respect to children who had turned positive. As soon as they go back home, the hospital admission, being in the ICU, being in the ward, the hospital atmosphere in itself causing a lot of fear and anxiety in them. And this particular child, because she also had a history of some heart ailments and she had to be admitted frequently to the hospital, started getting reminded of all the previous hospital admissions she had. And then there were a lot of nightmares. There was insomnia related to it, leading to some amount of panic attacks. So these are some basic cases that we have seen where we have post-COVID psychiatric symptoms. Now, what do we mean when I say post-COVID symptoms? Essentially, there is a term to describe these people, and they're known as long haulers, or they're also known as, or the conditions in itself is known as post-COVID syndrome or chronic COVID. Now, who do we term as long haulers? People who have turned negative, who have finished all of their isolation periods, everything is over, and from the time they have been termed as you're COVID-free and everything is fine, from that time, after 4 weeks. So if I turn negative today and everything is fine with me and say today is June 4th, then say probably by the end of June, if I start developing symptoms, one condition is after 4 weeks also the symptoms are present, or up to 4 weeks the symptoms are present. So chronic COVID would be even after 4 weeks of recovery, the symptoms are persisting, or up to 4 weeks at least the symptoms are persisting post-recovery. These are all known as long haulers. Now, what I am talking right now, or what I will be talking, the issue is there's not much of research that has been done here. We just have basic, very few case studies that we have from every country. So there are no firm conclusions as such, and we cannot say that this is how it is going to be with every case, but these are just some of the basic observations that we have had from the cases we have seen. So what exactly causes post-COVID symptoms? Who is vulnerable to it? What is the period of recovery? We do not have enough statistics to talk about these things, but as of now, we just know that these are probably the symptoms that can turn up in a few patients. Again, we do not know who might be vulnerable to it. So I think it's the job of the nurses and the doctors when the patients are getting discharged to keep them informed for them to be on the lookout for these symptoms so that they can reach out to us at an earlier stage. So we ensure we don't worsen the symptoms. Now, in terms of psychiatric conditions, what are the major symptoms that we can look at? We have the Guillain-Barré syndrome. These are all very severe disorders, which I think 1 in a lakh or 1 in 2 lakh cases. So I don't think it's very common, but Guillain-Barré is where we have a lot of post-ICU delirium that is present. Delirium as in, I mean, disorientation, severe memory disorders, difficulty with immediate recall, difficulty with recent memory, not being oriented to time and place, these sort of things, leading to severe confusion and some amount of personality changes. This is a Guillain-Barré syndrome. Other than that, we have usual causes such as dementia, stroke. Now, because of lack of oxygen in the brain or enough supply of oxygen in the body, that can result in a lot of these. I'm sorry. That can result in a lot of these disorders. So, neurologically or neuropsychiatrically speaking, we have stroke, we have Parkinson's, we have brain hemorrhage. These are all the neurological disorders that are present. So if at all you come across any such clients who have these sort of disorders, then the referral will happen to the neurology department and not to the psychiatry department. A specific referral to the psychiatric department happens if we notice any sort of anxiety disorders, any sort of mood disorders. So what are the common things that we have noticed? With respect to our cases, sleeplessness or insomnia, any people who have pre-existing psychological conditions, so if they already have a family history of psychological disorder, or if they themselves have been taking psychological medications so far, we know that those set of cases are a lot more vulnerable to these kind of psychological disorders. That apart, any sort of severe crisis or family event that has happened that has sort of disturbed them, that can make them more prone to psychological disorders. So the main set of disorders that we notice are fear, sleeplessness, anxiety, especially if the whole family has turned positive or if there has been a death in the family because of COVID. These are all the reasons that can cause bereavement and grief, and some amount of memory deficiencies or neuropsychological symptoms, which lead to worry, which lead to confusion, which lead to cognitive impairment, etc. The other set of disorders that we can see, one is encephalopathy. Encephalopathy is a milder version of the Guillain-Barré syndrome, where we have some amount of confused state, memory disturbances and psychosis and all of that. There might be some amount of inflammation in the brain also. Now, these are all again very rare conditions that I'm talking about. The main conditions that we see that I'm going to focus on in today's presentation would be, one is anxiety disorders. So amongst almost 2 lakh odd patients, we have noticed even in India that about 17% of the patients do turn positive for anxiety disorders, and about 1% of the patients have psychotic disorders. And more or less, from the age group of 40 to 60, what we have noticed is, because they have a lot of financial stressors to deal with, they have a lot of family problems and family issues to deal with. They have to deal with the environment, they have to take care of the family, they have to take care of the children, all of these things. Now, because of these many stressors that are present, we have noticed that a lot of people from the age group of 40 to 60 have to deal with psychosocial stressors, and this age group is more vulnerable to having psychological disorders. The other thing that we have noticed is, when we do MRI scans or when we do brain scans, we have noticed that some point in time there is excess of cytokines that is present in the fluid around the brain, and this sort of results in a lot of cognitive impairment. And also steroids, the usage of continuous steroids can lead to cognitive impairment. Now, keeping all of this in mind, there are 5 main disorders that I am going to address in today's presentation. So one, we're going to have anxiety and related things, which means stress, anxiety, and panic. These 3 things we're going to look at it together. And then we're going to have depression that is seen in clients. the next thing that we would address is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So staying in the hospital, sudden life changes, so much to deal with, a lot of fatigue, all these symptoms, uncertainty, these are all things that can actually cause severe trauma to somebody. So the whole process of hospitalization and unexpectedly this happening can result in a lot of trauma to them, and that trauma can in turn result in stress. So we have post-traumatic stress disorder, and then we have something known as the post-intensive care syndrome. So somebody who has had an ICU admission for quite a long time, that itself can result in PTSD. So anxiety, depression, PTSD, post-intensive care syndrome, and cognitive impairment. These are some of the main things that I would be addressing in today's presentation. Now, when we talk of anxiety and stress, what is it mainly that I'm trying to discuss here? When I say stress, what I mean by stress is there is a situation, and when I do not have the resources to cope with the demands of what the situation asks for, that results in a stress. As simple as an example, we're supposed to punch in at 9 o'clock. We're supposed to be in the hospital at 9. And 8:45, I'm still on road. There's a lot of traffic. I cannot reach on time. I know that the NS officer or the supervisor or somebody is going to mark me absent for this. So I do not have the time with me, nor do I have an empty road. All the facilities that are required for me to reach on time is not happening. So because the resources are less in comparison to the demands, that causes a lot of stress. So in general, this is the definition of stress. With respect to COVID, with respect to our own health conditions and whatever is happening right now, what may be the causes of stress? Relationships. One thing, it's a sad disease where unfortunately isolation is the main thing here. So you don't get to be with your loved ones. And especially when we know that somebody has turned positive, there's a lot of stigma attached to it. Nobody wants to come near us. Nobody wants to talk to us. And people start thinking that, oh, it's because of you, I turned positive. So relationships can get strained a lot, which can cause a lot of stress. Post-discharge, a lot of people are losing their jobs. Online classes are happening. It's too much to deal with on the professional front. And post-discharge, if I'm not even feeling healthy to deal with all of these things, that can increase the stress that I have. The third thing would be the kind of food that we take. Excessive salt, excessive sweets, carbs, unhealthy fatty foods. These can sort of cause imbalance with respect to our neurotransmitters, and that can sort of increase anxiety or depression. Then, of course, fatigue and the other physical complications of COVID in itself can cause a lot of implications. And of course, if there is a death in the family because of COVID, too much of isolation, just sitting in one room, not knowing what to do. Like we say, an idle man's brain is a devil's workshop. So too much of negative thought, negative thinking, either too much of work to do because I have not, for the past 1 month, I've been sick, I've been admitted, so I have to catch up on all of that work, or being in isolation and not having any work to do at all. Both these extremes can lead to a lot of stress. Now, increase and excess of stress can lead to anxiety, can lead to worry, can lead to burnout, fear, and a lot of distress. So moving on, when there is excess of stress, that sort of leads to anxiety. What do we mean when we say anxiety? So when you are psychoeducating the patients post-discharge, when as nurses you talk to the family members, you talk to the patients, these are the things that you can ask them to keep in mind or keep a lookout for. Essentially, they need to monitor these things once they get back. One, how do they not get stressed? Two, are they facing anxiety? If so, what exactly are they facing? So physically, how does anxiety manifest itself? Either you have palpitations, there is tightness in the chest, there's vomiting, there's hyperventilation, there's excessive sweating, or suddenly your body turning completely cold, there's dry mouth, there's hot and cold flushes. Essentially, whenever you get scared, whatever happens to your body, an increase of those things would qualify for anxiety. What happens emotionally, psychologically, what happens inside our mind? Either we're feeling hypersensitive, okay, because we've already tested positive once, we know what it is, we know how it feels, we're looking for those things again. So if I sit down and suddenly I start sweating, I'm like, okay, am I getting fever right now? If I start moving take a few steps or walk around, obviously I still have fatigue post-COVID. I'm going to be tired. So climbing a few stairs or walking around too much can increase my fatigability. When that happens, if my heart rate increases, I start wondering, okay, have I turned positive again? Feeling very easily irritated, feeling that, okay, this is just not getting over, feeling that something might go wrong, I'm not feeling okay, feeling paranoid about things, a feeling that, okay, I don't have control over things, multiple thoughts coming into my mind, or the same thought repeating again and again in my mind. These are all psychological measures of anxiety. A more severe version of anxiety, the same set of symptoms, but for no reason suddenly happening, for no, to an extent where somebody is gasping for breath, to an extent where they just feel like sitting down and saying, that's it, I can't take it anymore. I just want to drink some water. I want to sleep. That level of intense anxiety is something that is termed as panic attacks. So essentially, if you would have read in your biology, we have something known as the flight or fight response. Whenever there is something threatening to us, the autonomic, the parasympathetic nervous system, all of these get activated, which means either we are ready to fight with a certain threatening stimulus or we want to run away from it. And automatically, because that happens, our body prepares for that, and that results in an anxiety attack. So every time we feel that a situation is threatening, when the body starts preparing for that, all these physical symptoms occur, and that results in a panic attack. So with respect to thoughts that we have related to anxiety, what is the first thing that can come to our mind? When we are just, we have been discharged and we are sitting at home. Suddenly we are thinking, okay, is my pulse extremely low? What is happening? Am I dying? I have some tingling sensation in my hands and feet. Is this a sign of a stroke? Am I having a heart attack? I'm suddenly feeling breathless. Let me go check my oximeter again and again. I don't even feel like sleeping, because what happens if I don't wake up once I sleep? Are you sure the doctors have checked everything? They had so many patients to see. What if they've just ignored a few things that they were supposed to notice in me? I don't even feel like going out because I took so much of precautions, and despite all of this, I have turned positive. So I don't want to go anywhere now. I don't want to meet anybody now. I just want to sit in my room. At the same time, sitting in my room, it feels so isolated. It feels so depressive. These are extremes. So these are the kind of thoughts that run in the mind of a person that feels anxious. Now, the next set of symptoms that we have is depression. What exactly happens when somebody is depressed? Either there is loss of interest in previously pleasurable activities, which means I used to like watching movies, I like listening to music, I like reading books. Now I don't have the energy to do that, nor do I have the interest in doing any of that. I'm either excessively sleeping or I don't feel like sleeping at all. I feel extremely guilty about myself. I feel worthless. I feel helpless. I feel hopeless. I feel that nothing is going to improve. I'm perpetually sad. I don't have the energy to do anything. I want to get up and do it, but I don't have the energy to do it. Either I'm excessively eating or I don't feel like eating at all. And because of all this, there is this constant sense of agitation, constant sense of, I don't feel good at all, that sort of a thinking. And this results in reduction of attention and concentration. So what can happen when you have a depressive episode? There will be consistent thoughts such as, okay, I'm not going to get my job again. Now, when does depression happen? Either when there is a very severe incident that has happened, such as loss of job or financial constraints, because COVID takes up, if you don't have insurance, then obviously you end up paying a lot for hospital admissions. So something like that is happening. There's severe financial crisis at home. There is a death in the house. Any of these situations, if we look at it as a negative incident that has happened in our life, it can make us think in negative ways. So the sort of thoughts that we would be getting when we have a depressive episode is, okay, I'm never going to get a job again. I lost this job, but I don't have any opportunities of finding one more. I'm unworthy of all the love that if people are giving me. I was the one who made them positive. Why is it that they're giving me so much of love? I am not capable of taking care of the family. People don't even want to come near me. People hate me. I'm a complete failure. I don't even know how to wear a mask properly. I couldn't even manage something as basic as this. These are negative thoughts in the head. Now, the next condition that we can have, like I already said, is post-traumatic stress disorder. Staying in the hospital or having to go through a very negative incident that is very difficult for us to handle, that can result in PTSD. Physically, again, very similar to anxiety. What happens is every time we relive the trauma inside our head, we're feeling anxious about it. So whatever I explained with respect to the anxiety symptoms are probably the same thing that you can feel with the PTSD as well with respect to physical symptoms. The only other extra thing that we will have is there is reliving the trauma inside your head again and again. So the same incident keeps coming back to our mind again and again. And that causes us to have nightmares. It causes us to be easily agitated. We don't feel like talking to people. We don't feel like going back to the same places again or doing anything that we like doing for the fear that these incidents can repeat itself again. So cognitively or emotionally, again, we will start feeling very overwhelmed for having these thoughts inside us, inability to experience positive emotions or feeling guilty for experiencing positive emotions. So many people that we see, if there is a death in the family, if they laugh at after listening to a joke, or if they feel happy watching a program on TV, if they go out and get something, they feel guilty for it. They say, oh my God, there has been a death in the house. I was responsible for killing somebody. How can I be happy? How can I party when I know that something so bad is happening around me? So that sort of makes you enhance the trauma that we are feeling inside our head. Behaviorally, we start avoiding people. We don't want to meet people. We are always hyper alert. So if we're going in a car or if we go out to take vegetables, we're always looking around, who's next to me? When am I going to turn positive? What is happening? Excessively indulging in substance abuse, not wanting to do anything that we do on a day-to-day basis. These are all physical or behavioral symptoms of PTSD. Post-intensive care syndrome is just an amalgamation of all the three things that I just mentioned. What happens essentially is excess of ICU stay. I'm sure you would have all seen patients in the ICU. When they are there for a very long time, they are disoriented. It can result in delirium on a very short basis itself. Even 1 week, 10 days can make them disoriented. So imagine long stays, ventilators, the monitors, so many beeping sounds around them that can cause so much of anxiety and fear in them that once they get discharged, they can have PTSD about staying in the ICU. They can have anxiety and depression. Anything that reminds them of the ICU can in general result in fear psychosis. At the same time, because of the severe medications that they have taken, it can result in a lot of cognitive impairment. So again, similarly, how do we recognize those symptoms? There's excessive anxiety, there's insomnia, not being able to sleep, severe fatigue, negative thoughts, reliving the trauma again and again. Now, the only difference between PTSD and PICS is PTSD would be even for a patient in the ward at any point in time, any event that can result in trauma. PICS is specifically to people who have been admitted in ICU and either the family members or the patient itself getting panicky about the admission in the ICU. The next thing would be insomnia. Insomnia again is sleeplessness. So either it is initial, middle, or terminal. Either you're not able to fall asleep at all after you go to bed, or while you're asleep, suddenly you end up waking up in the middle of the night and you can't go back to sleep again. Or it's very difficult in the middle of the night, you end up getting thoughts. Terminal insomnia is you wake up way too early in the morning. So if you sleep at 10 o'clock, you end up getting up at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, and then you just can't sleep after that. Cognitive impairment is the other thing that we have. What happens in cognitive impairment? One, because of lack of oxygen supply to the body or to the brain, that results in the brain reducing in functioning, which causes cognitive impairment. So like I had already mentioned, because we have excessive cytokines that is present in the fluid around the brain, or either because of steroid medications or because of continuous stay in the hospital or in the ICU, continuous isolation not resulting in any brain activities, sleep disturbances, these are all causes that can result in cognitive impairment. Now, what do I mean when I say cognitive impairment? It is mainly in terms of attention and concentration issues. So you're not able to focus on the task, memory problems, disorientation, and difficulties with language. I was talking completely well until yesterday. Suddenly now post this disorder, I'm not getting the words at all. I don't know what to say. I can't remember what to say, such sort of things. Now, research has again shown that the more the age, the older you are, the more the cognitive impairment can be. longer ICU stay, substance use when you're not feeling well, mood and anxiety disorders, these can increase cognitive impairment. For people who have a history of dementia, of course, it's worse. For people with high D-dimer levels, it is more. Now, either it can just be a small brain fog, which is a very temporary thing. It stays for about 2-3 weeks and then it just goes away, or it can be long lasting for months together. So again, as doctors and nurses, we have to caution them to keep a track of this and come back to us if they have memory difficulties. Now, what is the solution to this? What are the issues that we have in the first place? Like I had mentioned, we have attention, concentration, memory, language. These are the difficulties. So as nurses, we can just give them a basic task saying, okay, immediate recall. If you guys must be used to doing mental status examination. If that is something that you do in serial MSCs, we look for memory. So you ask them for the address of their house, you give them 5 numbers, or you give them an address and ask them to immediately repeat it. You ask them to recognize all the sisters that are there, recognize their own family numbers, recall a phone number, recall birth dates. So, and in terms of attention, you ask to just give them a topic and see if they can talk about it for about 30-40 seconds or up till a minute. These are basic tasks that we can do ourselves. If not, we tell the family members that please monitor for these things on a day-to-day basis. If you think that they're having memory issues, there are enough and more brain training apps that are available for free. So just download a brain training app and ask them to take up exercises on concentration and memory on a day-to-day basis. So that will retrain the brain. Beyond that also, if that doesn't happen, then please reach out to the doctor. Now, I had already mentioned insomnia, difficulty in falling asleep that can in itself result in depression, anxiety, and a host of other issues. So what do you tell the patient when you're talking to them about insomnia? Tell them it is important that they need to have a proper sleep hygiene, which means they go to bed and they get up at the same time. There is no changing of time. If it is 10 to 6, every day it is 10 to 6. Don't eat much before you go to sleep. Take a small walk. Don't indulge in gadgets at least half an hour or 1 hour, because the blue light emission itself can take away your sleep. Do not watch news. Do not watch anything that causes anxiety before you go to bed. Read something very light or something like that. Drink probably half a glass of warm water before you go to sleep. These are all, in order to follow a proper sleep hygiene, these are basic techniques that one follows. Third thing we tell them, learn how to control your thoughts. So one thing is respect to what happens inside your brain. Those are your thoughts. The second thing is the situation in itself around you. What is happening? There are certain things that I can control, certain things that I cannot control. What the other person does, what is actually going to happen to COVID, whether it's going to go back or it's going to be there for the rest of our lives, whether the other person is taking care of himself, I can't control those things. What news I follow and what's coming on TV, I can't control. But which channel I choose to watch, how long I choose to watch, whether I choose to remain positive or not, finding good things to do, these are all things that I can control. So make a differentiation between what I can control and what I cannot control, and try to see how much of what I can control that I can master. And then would be thinking. Instead of sitting and thinking, I'm not even saying shift from negative thinking to positive thinking. I'm only trying to say, realistically, how can we look at the situation? Instead of blaming ourselves, saying, I keep making mistakes, I want to give up, I don't think this is ever going to continue, get over, I am the one who's causing a lot of issues. Instead of thinking that way, analyze it in a more practical way and say, yes, mistakes happen, but 5 out of 10 times mistake happened. 5 out of 10 times it did not happen. So let me look at the times that it did not happen. Let me see what I can do about it. So practically looking at situations would probably help you look at things in a more positive manner. So the last thing would be, instead of getting stressed out or anxious about something, instead of blaming yourself, take precautions for it. Use technology instead of looking at negative things. Connect to people through technology. Being grateful or practicing gratitude for what we have. So yes, I am healthy today. The hospital admission was really bad. It was too much to take care of. But I'm back home. I'm with my people. Things are safe. I did lose people, I understand, but I at least have a few of them who are alive. So at least be grateful to what we have. Limit exposure to news. healthy diet, relaxation, staying in the present, not living either in the past or in the future. We're trying to live in the moment and for today as much as possible. And all the feelings that we're feeling, talk about the feelings instead of trying to hide it within ourselves. So the gist of whatever I spoke so far, the only thing that I'm trying to say is, as nurses, how we can psychoeducate the patients, what we can do is 5 things that we look for in terms of psychological distress. A, we have anxiety, depression, PTSD, that is trauma, and then post-intensive care syndrome, and there is cognitive impairment. So we educate them about these 5 things and tell them, please keep a watch for all these things. You might be vulnerable to these things if you already have a psychological disorder, or if you are going through financial stressors, if things are not okay at home, something like that can increase these symptoms. Now, continuously staying in quarantine or looking at social media and having an unhealthy lifestyle, these things can also exacerbate. Now, beyond that, we have discussed techniques to sleep hygiene is something we have discussed, how to sleep better, how to think positively, how to be grateful to what we are doing, how to monitor for the symptoms, and how to reduce anxiety. So if these set of things can be psychoeducated to the patients, I'm sure they'll keep a watch for it. If it gets to an extent where they're not able to manage on their own, then send a referral to psychiatry. So this is the process for psychoeducating COVID patients post-recovery, post-discharge from hospitalization. So that is my presentation. I'll end with this. In case there are any queries, I'm open to discussion right now. If you don't feel comfortable to open up in front of everybody, my email ID and number is put up here. So you can always get in touch with me personally, and I'd be happy to help you out either with you regard to reaching out to your patients, or if you in person personally want to seek help, I am open to both of it. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Ms. Ashita. There is no any questions as such, but maybe our students may ask the questions like as you said through an email or like the number which you have shared with us. I express my heartfelt thanks to you for the very active participation and getting us to know about the importance of healthy mind. While the sanitizers, disinfectants, and masks may keep the infection at bay, but it's a calm mind that will fight the feeling of uncertainty and anxiety. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
And we have our principal, ma'am.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Ms. Ashita. I mean, your talk was very nice. I truly appreciated your talk. It was very much required, and you have also tailor-made it for nurses. So I truly appreciate your efforts. I think we have, although I think Ramya missed one question. One of the students has put one question in chat box for you. How do we give psychological support for person to take vaccine? Before vaccine and after vaccine. Probably she wants to ask post-COVID patient going to take vaccine. They have a lot of anxiety related to vaccination as well. So how do we address that?
Okay, so that would again be a very specific thing. We'll have, whenever we talk of anxiety, it is something related to your thought pattern. There's something that's going on in your mind that is causing you to be anxious. So what is the worry is what that we'll have to look at. So is the worry that even after I took the vaccination, I took the first dose, but still I have turned positive, or it has side effects. So what are the side effects? So there will be some sort of misinterpretation or misconception of the whole thing. So if we can spend some time with them to understand what the misconception is, and if we can give them the right sort of information, that would take away the anxious feelings that they have with regard to the vaccination. More or less what we have noticed is this: they think that it has a lot of side effects, they think it's not long term, they think that the side effects itself are more compared to what the benefits of the vaccination are. So if we can actually sit them down and psychoeducate them about what the vaccination is, what it does to you, it's not about not turning positive after getting vaccine, but it's about the severity of the illness being less, being able to avoid ICU admissions, That is what we're trying to look at. And also the fact that we will be acting as a buffer from somebody else turning positive. Although I know for a fact that I am young and I might not be having very severe symptoms, if I have a senior citizen in the house, if I turn positive and if I pass it on to the other person, there are all chances that they might have severe symptoms. So me taking the vaccination would ensure that they having severity of symptoms is lessened. So it's not just for us, but it's for the other person as well. So essentially the whole point is figure out what the fear regarding the vaccination is and address the fear specifically so that you can motivate them to take it.
Thank you. I think we don't have more questions in the chat box as well as question and answer column as well. So I thank you once again for
Thank you
taking
so much.
time
It was a
out
pleasure
and
to get to know you.
talking to us. Yes.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Can I exit the meeting?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. It was nice getting to know you.
Yeah, thank you so much. With this, we come to the end of today's session. We have another session which will be on tomorrow morning between 11 to 11:30. So I would kindly request everyone to log in 30 minutes before the session. Thank you all. Have a nice day.